okay, so what's in a word? What do we mean in the meaning? This chapter is all about something called the canons of construction. The canons of construction were utilized. Probably can't hear me now. The canons of construction were utilized in the recent McGirt ruling, and I think there's no question about that. But the origins of the canons of construction are really with a Supreme Court justice by the name of Joseph McKenna, and the first real Supreme Court case that utilized the canons, or sort of began to illustrate the canons, was this case of the United States versus Winans. So, but before we go there, I thought I would maybe look at a couple more. Okay, so let's look at this one. Okay, this is a treaty with the Seminole, okay? And I just downloaded this morning from the library. Treaty with the Seminole, 1832, okay? Just read the first paragraph, and you'll notice that, hang on. If you read the first paragraph, you might find something that just doesn't seem quite right. What's in a name? Okay. Well, anyway, I'm trying to point you to this. I mean, that's kind of funny, isn't it? Okay, so anyway, let's look at this one. This is the actual treaty that we're talking about today. So, the treaty with the Yakima. This is the treaty that produced the Winans case. But before we go there, what are some issues with regard to we've talked already about how Indian nations and members of federally recognized Indian tribes are not that's not a racial classification. It's a political classification. And as a political classification, it becomes subject to the whims of Congress, the politics of Congress. We know that. And we know also that in 1871, the Congress simply said in a rider to an Appropriations Act that the United States will no longer be making any treaties with Indian tribes. But the last part of that said essentially that this doesn't affect the legitimacy or the recognition, the obligation that the government has to respect past treaties. Okay. So, in other words, even though the country stopped making treaties with Indian tribes, it didn't remove the responsibility to comply with those treaties made before 1871. Now, yeah, some treaties have been broken. We know that, especially the ones after 1871. They're not treaties, but they're agreements. A lot of those are less stringent. But how important is an Indian treaty? Well, an Indian treaty, according to the Constitution, is a treaty. And a treaty is declared to be the law of the land in the United States. It's equivalent to the Constitution. So now we can choose to not recognize treaties with foreign states, can't we? Imagine the treaties that we've had with countries that we've gone to war with after we've had a treaty with them, or almost gone to war with. So the United States can of course abrogate treaties. It can, and other countries can abrogate or disregard treaties and break the treaties, but there are usually consequences for that. In the case of internal nations of people and treaties with domestic dependent nations, not international nations, the courts recognize that Native American or American Indian tribes, federally recognized Indian tribes, have no power against the United States when it comes to those treaties. I mean, they could break them, or they could abrogate them. They're not going to do that. So the United States, as the sovereign, the external sovereign around the Indian nations, has this obligation to those treaties, and not just a trust relationship, but really an honorable relationship. I mean, it's essentially, there has to be honor with it. Now, that doesn't mean that states and the federal government and individuals may ignore those treaty stipulations and break the treaty stipulations, but it does mean that the courts will recognize the treaties as the law of the land, okay? The treaties are the foundations of federal recognition. Sorry. I guess I can switch over to this thing. Well, let's keep it there. The treaties are, serve three really important facets, and this is out of from your author. Number one, they are the foundations for the government-to-government relationship. We know that. They also establish boundaries and define territory, and so that's very important to Native peoples. And they're also a really important symbol of sovereignty. Just the fact that there is a treaty, that there are treaties, is in itself very much a symbol of tribal nationalism. Yeah. So here's kind of a contradiction, of course. The United States has a sworn obligation to these political entities we call federally recognized Indian tribes. But those same political entities don't have the capability to negotiate with the United States the way they originally did. Okay, so that brings about this issue of fairness, an issue of obligation of the federal government. Now, I've got a treaty here for you just to kind of look at. There are some issues, though, if you happen to have read this chapter already. The trust doctrine of the federal government demands that treaties be interpreted in good faith. The Constitution commands that because these are laws of the land, they have to be recognized. They have to be enforced by the courts. But there are challenges to these interpretations, right? The challenges, number one, is the language. The treaties are written in English, right? And they're written in English from a different era, typically. You'll have to read Beowulf when you're in high school. Beowulf, or really for that matter, any Shakespearean play. Beowulf, of course, is Anglo-Saxon, and it's really kind of weird, hard to understand. But even Shakespeare's Middle English, I guess you would call it, is still kind of difficult to decipher sometimes in terms of meaning. So the writing of the treaties are written in a way that we probably wouldn't. I mean, of course, they're legal documents, so they're written with legalese to some degree. But let's look at this one. And this is 1855, so 150 years ago, or a little over 150 years ago. Here are the boundaries, of course. Let's look at the terms. Actually, Article 3 is what we want to look at. Article 3. Article 3, and provided that if necessary for the public convenience, roads may be run through the said reservation, and on the other hand, the right-of-way, with free access from the same to the nearest public highway, is secured to them, as also the right in common with citizens of the United States to travel upon all public highways. This wordage reminds me of something. It reminds me of the wording in the Bill of Rights. So I thought maybe we'd have a look at an example of this. See if I can switch back and forth like this. Whoop. Sorry about that. What happened? Oh, here we go. Wrong slide. What's this mean?
There are different ways you can interpret it.
Yeah, for 200 years, people have been arguing about what this means. Okay, so it's that, and there are ways. It brings up the issue of the sort of two schools of thought when it comes to interpreting the Constitution, and that is, should we understand it in the terms that the people at the time understood it, or should we try to interpret it from the present? So the same goes with treaties, with Indian treaties. Oh, sorry. I've got way too many documents open here. Okay, so here's Article 3, the second paragraph. The exclusive right of taking fish in all the streams where running through or bordering said reservation is further secured to said confederated tribes and bands of Indians, as also the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed places, in common with the citizens of the territory, and of erecting temporary buildings for curing them, together with the privilege of hunting, gathering roots and berries, pasturing the horses and cattle upon open and unclaimed land. So how do you interpret this section right? Well, the whole paragraph, this one sentence. What does that say to you?
To me, I interpret this as saying that the Indians can fish in any of the rivers that go through the reservation
Mm-hmm.
or are close to it, but then also in any common area. But because it says in common with the citizens of the territory, so I interpret that as saying anywhere that's open and unclaimed.
So would the citizens of the territory be able to go to the reservation to fish?
No, because that's not open.
Yeah, it's not open. So that means that the non-Indians would be what's the word? Encroaching. I always have to think of football before I get that word. They're encroachment, So the whites would be encroaching on the reservation, and they can't do that. We know that. So if you know a little bit about this treaty, let's back up a little bit. About the Oregon country that people started going to over the Oregon Trail. It was one of the more unique parts of North America politically because for a number of decades it was shared by two sovereigns. What were those sovereigns? They basically had shared, or what we might call sort of it was a weird agreement, but they essentially shared jurisdiction over it, or shared claims without creating a rigid border. And it was the United States and Great Britain. Okay, so Great Britain colonized the western part of Canada, and that was primarily through the Hudson Bay Company, which was a fur company. And on the United States side, the American Fur Company, run by John Jacob Astor, if you're familiar with all that, they made the claims early on in Oregon and the Columbia Valley, Columbia drainage basin, and of course Lewis and Clark, beginning in 1806, right, started up the Missouri River with the intent to find the Columbia and to find the Pacific from the Columbia, which they eventually did. It took them a while. So the United States had these claims, and Britain had its claims. And when that began, it was around the War of 1812, a little after the War of 1812. So relations, weren't that great, but they became better. All right. And so as the UK and the United States began to prosper after the Napoleonic Wars around 1815, they became sort of friendly together, And then what happened was James K. Polk became president, and Polk was the epitome of manifest destiny in the White House. He was the one who, took us to war with Mexico and took half of Mexico. All right, so the Polk administration, of course. There was a treaty between the United States and Great Britain in 1848 that established a boundary between Canada and the United States. And as soon as that happened, Oregon country, or at least the American side of Oregon country, became Oregon Territory. So the Oregon Territory is 1849. So that meant that 1853. So the 1853 treaty. Soon after that, the United States federal government starts sending in Indian agents to make treaties. The Indian office. So they start making treaties with all these tribes with the purpose, of course, to get land cessions to clear Indian title so that American settlers could take the land. In this treaty, this was with a group of tribes, relatively small tribes, in the Columbia River Basin along the Oregon-Washington boundary. And these people were fishermen. They were salmon fishermen. And that's how they would catch salmon and dry them out. And that was the basis of their economy. Their standard of living was actually really good, relative to other native peoples. They prospered. But it was all based on fishing. They had to have their fishing, access to fishing areas. And of course, it's not just fishing, it's salmon fishing, right? And salmon are anadromatous, is that what you call it? Anadromatous fish. They swim up rivers they live in the ocean, or at least they mature in the ocean. They swim up rivers, they spawn and lay eggs. And then the fry eventually make it to the sea where they grow up and start the cycle over again. So the river fish, the salmon and other, there's like steelhead trout do the same thing and shad do the same thing. But what the tribal members made sure to do in their treaties, what they made sure to do was, even though they were okay with going to a reservation that was completely theirs, they had to have access to those river fishing spots where they used nets to catch salmon during the salmon runs. Salmon runs in that part of in the Pacific Northwest and the Columbia Basin begin in August and they end around 1st November. Okay, so that's right now is the fishing season in Pacific Northwest. I have relatives in around the they're in Eatonville, Washington, which is right at the base of Mount Rainier. And when the Mount Rainier finally explodes, I'm going to have fewer relatives. So anyway, but they fish, and the salmon runs are going on right now, different species of salmon. But what the native peoples do, they would catch all these salmon in the late summer and fall, and then they would basically cure them. They'd dry them and hang them, smoke them, and they'd have plenty of protein for the rest of the year because it's highly preservable fish. So the fishing was the basis of their economy. And in the treaty, they made sure that they would have access to those sites, even off-reservation sites. Now, this is 1855. Indian policy is still evolving. It's pre-Civil War. It's about the time that a lot of the groups in the Middle West, south and west of the Great Lakes, not the Great Plains, but in the sort of the farm country today, the Corn Belt, it's when a lot of those people were being dispossessed from their land, sent to reservations in places like Kansas and Oklahoma. And so that's going on. And reservations are just beginning to sort of materialize in this sense. All right, so let's take a second and think about this. The treaties are written in English. These folks, a lot of them spoke English, but not everybody. And there's a lot of languages, actually, within the Pacific Northwest. Northwest tribes. When you say Northwest tribes, I typically think of people living in cedar plank houses and, actually making totem poles and smoking salmon and living high on the hog and having potlatches and all that kind of stuff, right? But the Northwest also includes the peoples who are located east of the Cascade Range in the drier country like the Assiniboine and so forth. A lot of these people are are basing their economies are based on fishing, some hunting and fishing. Let's think about this, though. If they didn't speak English, they were relying on people they trusted within their tribe who did speak English to negotiate, right? So and then those negotiating parties would come back and let everybody know this is what we got. This was the deal we made. Do you think it's a good idea, or would it have been a good idea to have written up a treaty in English and a treaty in the native language, although there weren't any languages that were even there are a lot of them that aren't even written down today. But a lot of tribal languages by this time had begun to be sort of interpreted with writing, and so there were maybe the possibility of writing some of these down. But just imagine that everybody had a language that could be written and was written. Would it be a good idea to write the language in both, or write the treaty in both languages? Say one in Yakima, if that's the language, and one in English. Would that have been a good idea? What do you think?
A trick question.
Huh?
Might be a trick question.
Yeah, of course it's a trick question. I asked it. Yeah, so the United States never really did this, and it's probably best. There is an example elsewhere in the world where this was done between the English and the native peoples. I'm not so sure if they did this in Canada, but they did it in New Zealand. You familiar with the Maori? Okay, so the way that Great Britain did this, in fact, it's about the same time, is a little earlier. But the English came in and about what they were trying to do in New Zealand. It was the North Island of New Zealand. They were trying to claim sovereignty over the island with the intention of allowing New Zealanders to be subjects of the British Crown and protected by the British Crown. And another part of that was the Maori, who were basically, they're not divided up into such great complexity like American Indians. They have a lot more sort of homogeneity. I don't want to say that, but they're more homogenous as a people. Of course, North Island, New Zealand is a lot smaller, but so what the Crown also wanted to do is make those folks subjects of the British Crown. Okay? And then secure land to them, to secure some title to land to them. And what happened was they wrote, because missionaries had been with the Maori for a while, and they had written down the language, so there was a written form of the language, and they wrote down a treaty, a very important treaty that established all this stuff called the Treaty of Waitangi. You ever heard of that? Treaty of Waitangi. Treaty of Waitangi was in English, and the Treaty of Waitangi was in Maori. And something like 530 Maori signed the Treaty of Waitangi that was in Maori, and very few of them, a couple dozen or so, signed the English treaty. Well, the English went by the English treaty, and the Maori made us, were assuming that everything was right according to their treaty. But there were a lot of things that could not be interpreted. Like, for example, the idea of sovereignty. Well, heck, we can't even figure out what sovereignty really means, can we, in this class? So, sovereignty is a hard concept, and there just wasn't an equivalent in Maori. So, what this led to was a treaty that was intended to clear everything up wound up causing all kinds of upheaval and eventually war between the Maori and the English. Okay, so it was probably a good thing that Indian treaties between the United States and Indian tribes were not composed in native languages. Just a point. Okay. So here we got this example of this treaty, and you all have interpreted it the way that Justice Joseph McKenna interpreted it. But let's talk a little bit about how this case came about. The area of the Columbia River. Let's map. I meant to get you a map. Anyway, the Columbia River is a huge river. It's kind of the Mississippi of the western, part of the north of the continent, if there would be such a thing. It's a huge, huge river that drains, much of the Cascade Range. It's massive amounts of snowmelt. And so where the Columbia River is sort of pinched off by the basalt flows of the Columbia Plain, it forms a sort of a natural dam, and the river has carved down the Columbia Gorge. And so if you've ever flown into Portland, you fly right down. Well, if you're flying from Oklahoma, you fly right down into the Columbia Valley, and it's pretty amazing because it's this massive gorge, and the river is nearly a mile wide sometimes, and then it suddenly gets choked like that. And so the river goes from being like a mile wide, like the Mississippi, to a width of 140 feet. All right, so that is the super highway for salmon going up the Columbia Valley, up the Columbia Basin. And so, anyway, and the treaty is made in 1855, and the brothers Winans Audubon and Linnaeus, Wyans, kind of interesting first names. They arrived after 1889. Oh, there's a mistake in your textbook. I want to make sure you see that. Okay, so let's. Washington became a state in 1889, November of 1889. Although it says 98. Okay, that's not right. I need to start using hand lotion. Okay. Anyway, my fingers are all dried out. So in 1855, this is when the treaty is made. And then state authority, I don't know if you can read that, state authority extends over ceded tribal lands in 1889. So we're talking about lands that were ceded to the federal government with the treaties, basically the treaties of 1854 and 55. There were a lot of treaties. The Yakima Treaty is the one that's given as an example. 1889, well, 1889 was, the United States is becoming an industrial power by 1889. And part of that new industrial might is food processing and the ability to preserve food. Canning is actually something that's pretty new, believe it or not. You'd think since your grandma canned peaches and green beans and stuff that it's been around forever, but it really hasn't been around that long. The ability to produce canned goods in mass quantities, at least, got started, late 1800s. And one of the most important commodities that canning allowed for was salmon, and later tuna, and later all kinds of other stuff. But you could, if you could catch salmon, then you can process them and then put them in the cans, and they're basically cooked in the can. But once they're cooked, it's germ free and seals up.
Yakima, right?
Yes.
So I got added to a group on Facebook. This is a little off topic, but not really. It's called Yakima Nation Hunters and Gatherers.
Uh-huh.
And I think they're trying to share their wisdom about how they survive and how they fish salmon and stuff. But these people in here, they can elk, they can salmon, they can all kinds of other stuff. And I never heard of that.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah, like in Alaska, you can still, in Alaska, you have to get what's called a subsistence permit. There are a lot of people in Alaska that live on fishing and hunting. I mean, that's their food. That's all they get. So you shoot caribou, you shoot moose, and you can the meat, put it in mason jars and cook it and can it.
Yeah, it's really different.
Yeah. So anyway, the salmon industry is focused on the Columbia River and eventually, in British Columbia. And so that's a big money-making commodity with the canning industry. Other places would be like, Monterey, California with sardines and stuff like that. Well, salmon, since they're anadromous, I can never remember that word, they're swimming upstream. It's easy to catch salmon with nets and that sort of thing, and that's what the native peoples did. Anybody ever fish for salmon? They don't really bite. You snag them, all right? But they're not really interested so much in eating when they're swimming upriver. They're interested in other things. So, procreation. But the industry began using fish wheels and fish weirs. Fish weirs guide the fish into a certain area, and then they put a wheel at the end of the weir. And a fish wheel is basically a bunch of big nets that catch them, and they turn like a Ferris wheel with the current. The fish are swimming upstream, and so as the flow is coming this way and the fish are going this way, then the net or the fish wheel is turning like this, okay? To you, that's counterclockwise, right? So it's turning like this. The fish swimming upstream slowly, and they get picked up and dropped into this. I'll show you what it looks like. I love to fish, by the way, if you don't notice. This is a fish wheel. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it looked great to me. Sorry. That's not it. There we go. Fish wheel. And this is in Yukon. Okay, this is in Alaska. There's see the big old king salmon. And then they hit this slide right here and they slide out into a holding container. Next one coming up. Cool, huh? Makes me hungry already. And the thing doesn't even require power. It just goes around and around and catches fish.
How many? 10? 6?
Was this invented by
What?
natives or white people?
That's a good question. The theory is that the Swedes brought it to the United States, or it was a Swedish invention. But it could also have been invented in Scotland. It could have been invented by the Irish, by the Russians. Okay, the Russians, of course, colonized Alaska. But pretty much the settled on idea is that the Swedes brought it to Ohio to catch fish that were anadromous to the Great Lakes, to Lake Erie, believe it or not. So kind of weird. But native people use them today, usually much smaller scale. It's like here's an example of some native guys using a fish wheel.
Where's 007?
No, that's 007. I got to see this one. I love 007.
Okay, one more time.
Playing the fiddle by the fish wheel, isn't it cool? This is your subsistence live fish wheel right here.
But it doesn't use any power, does it?
No power. But they don't last real long because when it floods, they're gone. You have to rebuild them.
Yeah.
They're usually on rafts, so you got to, anchor the raft. It looks kind of like they're moving, but they're not moving. All right. So anyway, the fish wheel. So what happens is you've got this real strategic fishing area where the Columbia Gorge gets pinched, and it's not public land, but it's homesteaded. So it's open to American homesteaders, and the Winans homesteaded this place. And so they had a title, a fee simple title to the land around the river. And okay, so anyway, what happened in this story? There's a place called Celilo Falls. Celilo Falls was a traditional tribal fishing area at a series of cascades and waterfalls along the Columbia Gorge, just east of the Cascade Range along the Oregon-Washington boundary. And this is a place that the native people say this has been a place where people have lived for thousands of years, okay? And because it's a perfect place to fish for salmon. And anyway, these Winans built a giant fish wheel, or maybe probably a series of fish wheels, right at the choke point for the salmon. Now, your textbook makes a big deal out of, well, these white people were taking all the salmon out of the Columbia River, and there's no possible way they could have done that. So it's really not reducing. The issue is not that they're reducing the salmon run. They're not catching all the salmon. The problem is they had access to the land, and they had it in private fee simple land. And native peoples wanted to get there and fish, and they wouldn't let them. So the issue here is access to the land access. And when Indian folks would come in to fish, the Winans said, you're not allowed here. This is private property. So it was what they did was they were basing their claim on trespass laws of the state of Washington. Okay, all states have trespass laws. And the Indian people said, well, we got treaty rights that are 50 years old. Okay, and those treaty rights allow us to fish here. So this is what started it all. So the Winans, okay, basically going to federal court to say, stop these Indians from, fishing on our property. And the court, federal district court, rules in their favor. Says, okay, well, these native people are crossing into private property, and you can't do that in the United States. So the United States, representing the Indian tribe, probably Bureau of Indian Affairs or something, appeals in circuit court, appeals in the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, and with that, in that one it was upheld. Let's see, is that what happened? Anyway, it winds up going to the Supreme Court, and it's not so much because of the fishing issue. It's because the question was, does the treaty allow native peoples access to non-reservation ceded land? And the question was in the wording. Okay, so let's go back to that. Go back to the treaty, if I can find it. Here it is. It's all to this line right here. So the white folks are saying the right of taking fish at all the usual accustomed places in common with the citizens of the territory. Okay, so what the Winans are arguing is that, yeah, native peoples can fish wherever white people can fish, and white people can't fish on our property either. Okay, so they're saying it's not that we're discriminating against Indians, we're discriminating against anybody else because we have a commercial fishing operation and this is ours because we bought the land. Okay, so that's their interpretation, and the tribal and the government's interpretation is that wording means that they have the right to fish within their ceded land in the where is it? In the usual and accustomed places. Okay, so usual and accustomed places that they always had. So that's the way the federal government interprets it. So that's a difficult one, isn't it? The language is kind of hard to navigate. What would you have done? Well, what the court said was, do those treaty fishing rights survive after a session? That's pretty much it. but we're not even really concerned so much with the big question of the court case as we are the way it was arrived at. That's what we're concerned with here. So the Winans, the Winans also made this, you probably can't see it real well. They made the case that, they were doing everything legally according to the laws of the state of Washington. They had a license, et cetera. And, they said, hey, we're the ones who bought the license to use the fish wheel. We're doing everything properly. So what is at issue here is access. And the reason we're looking at this is because this very ambiguous wording, I think you could probably say, that ambiguous wording was interpreted in favor of the Indians. Okay? It was intentionally ruled and presumed to be in favor of the Indians. Okay? So Winans argues that Indians had no greater access by law than non-Indians, which could be excluded by state trespass laws. But this is another thing I want you to remember, and I've said this before. What are treaties? Next time you're having a conversation with somebody, at a cocktail party or something like that, about Indian treaties, okay? Y'all go to cocktail parties, I guess. And they say, the United States was fair to the Indians. We wrote treaties, and those treaties give them certain rights and privileges that are even, that are beyond the privileges of the non-Indian, right? So how do you respond to that? You say, Indian treaties never gave anything to the Indians. Indian treaties gave everything to the non-Indians. And it's not the treaty giving it, it's the tribe giving it. So the tribe gives something to the non-Indians. That's what the treaty is all about. It's land and it's certain privileges or whatever. But Indian treaties are really significant in that they don't always give everything up, right? They recognize retention or reservation, if you will. They retain, and I don't want to say rights because all of us think of rights, 95% of us think of rights as things like the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, okay, freedom to petition the government, all that stuff. Right to keep and bear arms, maybe not. But that's what we consider our rights, And the way the constitutional framers said, is they say that, they said that, these were natural rights given to you by the creator of the universe, and that nobody has no sovereign can take them away from you justly. And that's what the Constitution is all about, protecting individual God-given rights, if you will. Indian treaties don't give rights to anybody. They only reserve, they give up certain things, and they sometimes reserve something that we shouldn't call rights. What should we call them? We should call them interests, right? Interests. Maybe you know somebody who gets a royalty check every fiscal quarter from oil and gas revenue, okay? They get that because they own part of mineral rights, that is access or privileges or interests in the mineral wealth of the below the surface. And that's kind of the same thing that we're talking about, okay? So if you look up the term right, as I did this morning at about 3:30, okay, in the dictionary to see, there are 1,000 different, but, a right in this sense is like an interest. It's your ownership. And the Treaty of 1855 was interpreted to not give up or to retain those fishing rights. Okay? And that's the thing that McKenna really made apparent here. is that, this is a really good line. In other words, and this is McKenna writing, in other words, the Indians were given a right in the land, the right of crossing. That's not it. It's this one right here. Maybe that's not it. Basically, what he's saying is that the Indian Treaty allowed non-Indians to do things. It didn't disallow Indians to do anything. Okay, so tribes won the case. Here it is. Joseph McKenna noted that treaties were not a grant of rights to Indians, but a grant of right from them, okay? Not to them, but from them. So keep that in mind. All right, so the reason we're even looking at this is because McKenna, by doing this and making this ruling, was essentially outlining what would later be known as the Indian Canons of Construction. That is sort of a gentlemanly rule, okay? Pardon the gender specificity, but sort of a gentleman's rule within courts. And so that might mean the Supreme Court. It might mean the United States Circuit Court for the 10th District. It might mean the United States Circuit Court of Appeals for the 9th District, okay? Those are different courts, and they don't necessarily follow each other's lead. So there's not like, it's not like there's a ruling over here and they have to follow that. They don't necessarily have to do that. We're in the 10th District, which is out of Denver, okay? Arizona is, in the 9th District. And it's Phoenix, I guess. All right, so these are the Indian Canons of Construction, according to McKenna. This is what he sort of outlines the future court to do. Courts must seek to understand the terms of a treaty as the Indians of the time would have understood them. So this is basically a gentleman's rule within the court, a guideline, and it's a guideline based on those obligations that the United States federal government has to Indian tribes based on the trust doctrine and to follow their own constitution, okay? The law of the land. So the courts have to seek to understand the terms of the treaty as the Indians of the time would have understood them, allowing for that problem of language, So they're saying, if anybody was misunderstanding something, it would have been the Indian tribes who were trying to figure out what this English document said. So we must defer to them. We must defer to them. That's the way to do things. That's the honorable way of doing business. There may not be any technicalities to deny the spirit of a treaty. Okay? So you can't do I always call it the Bill Clinton two-step, back before you were born, in the 90s, there was this thing called the Lewinsky scandal, okay? And the Republican Congress impeached Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton. And they put him on trial, and he's arguing, and it came down to, in the argument, at the end of the argument, it came down to that, and this is Bill Clinton, you can probably look it up, he says, the argument, somebody asked him the last question, and he said, well, that would depend on what the meaning of is. All right? So anyway, he was a slick character, right? Getting off on a technicality, all right? And that's not going to be done by the courts. Number two, the courts must take into account any relevant historical context that would have affected how the treaty was understood at the time. All right, so this is referring to Indian treaties. In other words, you've got to understand what's going on here. And in 1855, the tribes were being told that they needed to move to reservations and that their lives were going to change dramatically. They didn't have all the land that they once had. And so you can probably assume that they had an interest in keeping access to those fishing grounds. So this brings up a couple other points, and this is a good point made by your textbook author. He says, in general, when you're looking at a document, you don't pick and choose. You don't cherry pick the terms. Once a term is used within a treaty, the meaning stays the same. So that's a rule. Also, every word in a document has meaning and cannot be ignored. That's a big one. So there aren't any, in an Indian treaty, there's no assumption that, oh, well, that's not the important part, okay? Every single part is relevant. That's why the language is kind of, I guess you'd say, terse, something like that. Okay. So the canons of construction. Here are the 3 Indian canons of construction according to your textbook author. I don't really agree exactly with what he identifies here, but this is the gist of it. Treaties have to be interpreted as Indians would have understood the treaty at the time it was written. Ambiguities, this is a big one, ambiguities in the treaties must be resolved in favor of the Indians. McGirt, right there, okay? If there are any ambiguities, got a favor. And there's the problem with that McGirt decision was there's a tremendous amount of ambiguity. It could have gone either way, all right? And then finally, treaties must be liberally construed in favor of the Indians. That's the one I don't really so much agree about, because the problem with that is, and what a lot of more conservative justices have done, and also this applies also to other federal courts, is that there's no rule that justices and judges have to comply to the canons. Doing so is considered to be the honorable thing to do, but then some people will say, well, that's just politicizing it. That's playing politics, okay? All right. When we come back on Tuesday, I'm slowing down, sorry about that, but this is important stuff. When we come back on Tuesday, we'll continue to talk about fish, okay? And we're going to look at something called the Bolt decision, which is the decision in the United States versus Washington, and that's Washington State, and it goes back to this very same treaty again. So let you go for now, and let's talk about, let you go for now, and we'll continue on with chapter 11 on Thursday or Tuesday of next week. So if you haven't read chapter 11, try to read it and read it slowly. It's very important, and it's also kind of long, but the cases are really interesting. Give you some examples, like the U.S. versus Washington. Again, it has to do with fishing rights, but fishing rights 70 years later. Okay, so Winans is 1905. This comes into the 1970s, and this was during the American Indian movement, and a lot of the civil rights stuff and native rights were sort of entwined with this ruling, and it has really big consequences for conservation efforts, and it helps in 1974, Nixon, right? It also is a thing that helps cement the sovereignty of Indian tribes, because what it does is it forces the states to recognize the rights of tribes to manage natural resources. In this case, the fish population. So it kind of implants tribal government into the regulatory structure of states. It forces them to work together. Oh my gosh. You think we can probably work together? You think the state of Oklahoma and tribes could work together? Yeah, they can. They can. We don't need to create a new state. We don't need to chop Oklahoma in half. The next, it just gets better. The next case, Washington versus Cougar Den, it just has a good name, okay? But the Cougar Den deal is about gasoline. And one of my favorite ones in the whole book is U.S. versus Dion. And you'll like that one too. If you like Eagles, you'll love this one. Okay. All right. Y'all have a good day and good rest of the week.